My guest today is Susan Cushman, who's a native of Jackson, Mississippi, currently living in Memphis. She's an author of 7 books. The latest available now is John and Mary Margaret. Welcome, Susan.
Hi, Jason. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad you're here with us today. And I know we have a lot to talk about, so we're just going to get right into it. Does that work for you?
Yeah, dive on in.
Excellent. So, Susan, I always like to ask this question to kick off in a way to get to know each other. Since we don't know each other,
right?
I like to ask this question as a little bit of an icebreaker. What's something that you nerd out about?
I love that nerd out.
I stole it from another podcast. I'll admit it, my friend's podcast.
I especially love it because the name of your podcast is Talking to Cool People, and I think nerds are the coolest of all people. Yeah,
agreed.
I've got some engineers and IT kids in my family.
Yeah,
but for me, it's books. It's got to be books. I love contemporary Southern fiction, but also memoirs by famous people or people who struggle with mental health issues. Favorite book was Pat Conroy's Prince of Tides, which inspired me to write because he used his dysfunctional family to inform his fiction.
Yeah.
Mary Carr's memoirs, especially lit, and the celebrity memoirs by Diane Keaton and Demi Moore and Robin Roberts. I guess that's what I nerd out about.
Yeah. The Prince of Tides was a movie with Nick Nolte and Barbara Streisand, wasn't it?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah,
from Pat Conroy's book. And I met Pat before he died, and his wife and I are friends, and they're just great people. I recently spoke at the Pat Conroy Literary Center in Beaufort, South Carolina, which is an amazing place.
Yeah. What's is your love of books? Was this something that you've always had? Like, was growing up, were you attracted to books and writing specifically at a young age?
You know, this is real unusual. Almost all my writer friends grew up loving books, and I did not. When I was 5 years old, we got our first television, and I grew up loving television and movies, and at one point wanted to be an actor. You know, I loved all of that part more, and I really didn't start loving books as much until I was an adult, which is a little odd for a writer. I did always like to write.
You did, okay.
And that's weird too, to love to write more than you love to read. But now it's both. Now I love both, yeah.
Yeah. Did you, growing up, did you write for the school newspaper? Did you have any sort of writing hobbies?
Yeah. Well, let's see, junior high, we had a literary journal. In high school, I wrote for the school newspaper and was business and advertising manager of it 2 different years, which led into a lot of marketing that I did later in life. So, and I thought I would be a journalist, or I would be in advertising. I wasn't sure what I was going to do at that point, but it was a great introduction.
Yeah.
Our high school paper was really good.
Yeah, I have an advertising degree from the School of Journalism at the University of Minnesota.
Awesome.
And I realized, I think I always knew this, but I was just talking to somebody. I do not like writing at all. I just don't like the process of it, which is why I have a podcast, because I like to talk to people and ask questions and communicate. Right. I love communicating. Right. I just don't like writing. So I'm always fascinated by the idea of sitting down and writing one book, let alone 7, just gives me I just wouldn't want to do it. Because I wouldn't know what to write, but 2, I just don't enjoy the process of writing. Some people really love, my dad likes to write.
Yeah.
And his like to sit down, put your word into either the keyboard or, write with an actual writing utensil. And that just does not excite me at all.
Well, it's hard. Elizabeth Berg is one of my favorite authors. And when asked if she likes to write, here's her answer. I love to have written.
Yeah.
And that's really how I feel too. Once I've finished with a good day's work or a good chunk of a chapter or even 1,000 words, then it's like, oh, now it's fun. But it's difficult in the process. Occasionally it's fun. More often than not, it's just hard work.
Yeah. I would imagine it's very fun to walk into the bookstore and see something you've written with your name on it there. That must be the best.
It is. It's awesome.
Yeah, that's very cool. All right. So we're going to move Susan we're going to talk a little bit about comfort zone. And the way to define that is the thing that it's the thing that's easy for you, the thing you like doing, the thing that I'd say, hey, Susan, will you go do this? And you'd be like, yeah, that's easy for me. So what's something that is inside of your comfort zone that might be outside of somebody else's?
Right off the bat, I think about talking and writing about religion
Mm,
and spirituality. I'm a convert to Eastern Orthodox faith, and even studied iconography and learned to paint them and taught icon workshops. But often, church and religion are difficult for some people to talk about. I also am very easy to talk about things like sexual abuse and eating disorders, which
yeah.
have been part of my life. And I've read a ton of books that other people have been willing to write to share their journeys with it. And so I'm pretty open to talk about those. And they appear in my blog. I have had a blog since 2012. Those
Hmm.
issues appear in there. They also showed up in my first novel, Cherry Bomb, and some of my short story collections deal with difficult issues that I'm not worried about talking about.
Yeah. When you bring this to your work and as a published author, do you get negative feed? You probably get feedback. Do you get negative feedback, or is it generally like, thank you for putting these issues out there so that we can
Yeah.
have a conversation about
It,
them?
it's been amazingly positive.
I'll bet.
And maybe the people who don't like it either quit reading it or just don't bother to write a bad review. I've gotten so few bad reviews on Amazon and Goodreads for any of my books. I mean, some of them are kind of funny. I like to read them. I'm hoping for constructive criticism, but
Yeah.
usually it's something. But my favorite bad review, my short story collection, Friends of the Library. This person's first line was, "I don't like short stories." Well, on the cover of the book, it says, "Friends of the Library, short stories."
I know. I
And
love
she,
that.
and she goes on to talk about why she doesn't like short stories. And I'm like, well, I can't believe you bothered to keep reading it, you know, and to go on Goodreads and write on Amazon and give it a 2 or 3 stars when everybody else was giving it 4 and 5. I take it
Yeah.
with a grain. Reviews don't bother me.
No.
You
Have
know,
you ever, do you ever watch, do you ever watch The Tonight Show now with Jimmy Fallon?
yeah,
Have you ever seen when he does I think it's Jimmy Fallon, where he does the thing where the celebrities will read like reviews about
yeah,
themselves on Twitter, and
yeah.
it's hilarious. They'll be like, "I don't like your hair," or it'll be like the thing like, "Okay, what do you want me to do with that?"
Right, exactly.
That's so funny. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's. I don't know how you feel about this, but I think the thing about like, I don't like short stories. There's just people that just want to be heard and just want to complain, and it just
Yeah,
so happens that Amazon's a great place to do that.
I guess so. I guess so.
Yeah, but I
And
was
what's
wondering, like, yeah, go ahead.
also funny is that I used to not like short stories. I
Yeah.
didn't read them a whole lot. And so when I wrote that collection, it was a new genre to me. And I have a couple of good friends who are prolific short story authors, and I was able to get some feedback from them because it's a totally different animal than writing an essay, which I'd done a bunch of, or writing a full length novel or memoir. It's different. I like it now that I've done it because each story has a short narrative arc.
Yeah.
So it's much easier to write, you know, 20 pages than 500 pages.
Yeah. What in the literary world, how do you define a short story? Is there a definition of what that actually means?
Yeah, well, it's going to follow the narrative arc of a novel, with the beginning and then the climax and then the resolution at the end. But it's more about word count. Like a novella, which is a short novel,
Hmm.
is more like 30 or 40,000 words. A novel starts at about 50,000. A short story is typically 20,000 or less,
Got
you
it.
know.
Okay.
But as far as the structure, it's really obviously it cannot be as complex. There's not
Yeah.
time. So you don't want as many characters to have to, you barely have time to introduce more than 3 or 4 main characters
Right.
in a short story. So it's
Yeah.
simpler that way. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. I learned something new today. I was thinking about Stephen King because he writes obviously like massive books, but then I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Shawshank Redemption was considered a novella. It wasn't actually that long. One of
Yeah.
his most famous books is actually, I think is called a novella, a
Okay.
novella. And then he's also a prolific short story writer too. He's got
Right.
a lot of
Right.
those things. So let's take a look at the reverse of this now, Susan. What's something that is outside of your comfort zone that's going to be inside of somebody else's?
Probably talking about and writing about politics. I don't do this very often. The rare occasion when I go there on Facebook, I'm instantly sorry that I went there. No matter which side you're on, somebody's going to start throwing crap at you. They're just going to, you know. And I'm going, why did I do that? And I just go back and delete the post. Usually because it's not doing any good. Now on my blog, I used to be a little bit more political, but once again, I just decided um, you're not going to convince anybody of
No,
something on
no.
there. And I'm not the kind of person who wants to convince. I don't
Right.
want to convince anybody of my religion, my faith, my spirituality, my political leanings. I respect other people in all of those areas.
Yeah.
So I just don't go there with politics, unless I have to.
So what I'm hearing is you follow one half of the old idiom, which is you never talk politics and religion. You talk a lot of religion and you talk no politics. That's great. That's funny.
It.
That's funny. So your books, and we're going to talk more about your whole body of work, but specifically about John and Mary Margaret. They don't get too much into politics, is my assumption based on what you just said.
Well, it's interesting now that I've said that, because John and Mary Margaret covers 50 years of civil rights history.
Got it.
So, but it's really not about politics in the sense of being about the right and the left and Democrats and Republicans, but it is about race.
Yeah.
So if you want to call that political, I call that cultural.
Yeah, I think that's probably more accurate.
Yeah.
Which ends up being political. I don't know that it's quite as political as it used to be. I mean, it used to be one of the primary things, but we'll talk more about this after the break, specifically about the book.
Sure.
I've one more question for you before we take a really brief.
Okay.
I want to ask you about speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I was able to give you, let's pretend that this podcast was listened to by everybody on the planet, which would be amazing, but it's not. It's like not everybody on the planet's going to read your books. And I would give you 5 minutes to give a speech. What would you talk about, Susan? And what would be your call to action to the audience at the end of your speech?
Wow, I could go a lot of different directions with that.
Yeah.
Because there are so many things I do care about. But I think right now, my speech would be about racial injustice and inequality, especially in America, but also as it relates to the caste system in India and what happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany. I became real aware of all this last summer when I read Isabel Wilkerson's amazing book, Caste, spelled Casce.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I had already, as a white woman from the South, I had already gradually been having somewhat of an awakening, and I'm using quotation marks.
Yeah.
Which some people get pushback about and don't like that term. Even a lot of Blacks don't like talking about being woke, Yeah. And yet I don't know what else to call it, because it is part of what's been happening to me in a good sense. And so when I read that book last summer, it was like, wow, my eyes were opened more and more. So I think my call to action would be to somehow call people to have an open heart and mind, to accept any racism that might be in our hearts, and to have a new way to look at the issue historically, to forgive ourselves and accept others. One of my favorite quotes, I have a lot of quotes in my book, John and Mary Margaret, but one of my favorite ones is by William Faulkner. And he says, never be afraid to raise your voice for honesty and truth and compassion against injustice and lying and greed. If people all over the world would do this, it would change the earth.
That's beautiful.
Thought so.
I agree. He was a smart man.
It was.
Excellent. Well, Susan, we're going to take a very brief commercial break, and we'll be right back after this.
The Talking to Cool People podcast is brought to you by Jason Frizzell Coaching. Jason works with amazing people who are looking to find and develop their passion and purpose and create their journey to wherever it is they want to go. Check us out at jasonfrizzell.com, Facebook, or on Instagram. Jason loves hearing from anyone who thinks it would be cool to connect, to be coached, or to be a guest on our show. Email him at podcast@jasonfrizzell.com or DM him on Facebook and Instagram. And now, back to some more amazing conversation on Talking to Cool People.
Right.
And Susan, we are back. So, I like to ask this question of all my guests, and I make it very, very broad,
All right.
specifically for a reason. So what do you want the audience to know? What do you want all of us to know about you?
Well, that I grew up in Mississippi in the 50s and the apocalyptic, life-changing 60s when I was in high school and a teenager. And I got married young. I went to Ole Miss, but only for 1 year because my husband was a senior there my freshman year, and we were dating and then engaged. And so I got married when I was 19. I was a stay-at-home mom for a lot of years while my husband was pursuing his career. And we adopted 3 children, 2 from South Korea, and then our white boy who's from Mississippi. So that's a bit of my personal journey. Also along the way, very significant for this Presbyterian girl from the South was that we converted to the Eastern Orthodox Church, which actually my husband is a priest, an ordained priest in the Orthodox Church. And that was a huge change for me spiritually. I visited monasteries. I've studied and painted icons.
Yeah.
So that part of my life, and then the adoption and the kids. And then the two Korean kids, our daughter's husband is Black, and they have 2 mixed race daughters.
Yeah.
And then our son, Jason, who's from South Korea, his wife is Hmong, which is also Asian.
Yeah.
So they have 2 mixed race Asian American daughters. So that diversity within my family has a strong impact on everything I think and do and write.
Yeah. Was the so you adopted the South Korean children in the 70s, 60s,
80s,
late 60s,
80s,
in the
early
80s.
80s. Mm-hmm.
What was the did you get any pushback, or was there any sort of controversy around that at the time? Being, and again, like, you know, like I don't know exactly the context in the moment, but
Right.
yeah, I'm just curious what that experience was like for you.
Exactly. Well, in Jackson, Mississippi at the time, there was kind of a community of people who were adopting kids from Korea through Holt's International Agency. So there was sort of a support group there, and our family and church and close friends were all so supportive that if there was somebody outside of that circle who didn't like it, I didn't know about them. Now, I will say that both of my Korean kids had incidences where they were bullied when they were in elementary, junior high, around in there, just by kids. And what's interesting is they went to a school that was the majority Black, minority white, and then smaller minority Asian. But the Asians were Vietnamese. And so my Korean adopted kids, most of their friends were white or Black because the Asian community there was kind of kept to themselves. You know, they were in English as a second language and all of that. So, you know, they were well accepted in all the circles that mattered to me. Yeah.
That's good. This just feels like a really natural point to talk about the book, John and Mary Margaret.
Sure.
Well, but before we go into the book that's the newest book, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the series of books. And I have a few questions. So I've looked at them. Curious, is there a through line? Is there what was the inspiration for you to release your first novel? What's your inspiration behind all of this as a writer?
Right. Well, I started on my first novel, Cherry Bomb. It took about 6 or 7 years because to begin with, I worked with first I wrote a memoir, and then I decided I wanted it to be a novel instead. So that was a huge switch. After completely writing about some things in my own life that were very personal, I decided some of them were actually going to hurt some people, and I didn't want to do that. Yeah. So I didn't just change the names and say, now it's a novel. You can't do that. Yeah. A memoir and a novel are 2 different things. But I let some of those experiences inform the characters in that book. And it was called Cherry Bomb, and it was about a little girl who escaped from a religious cult where she had been molested by her father. And she gets a scholarship to the Savannah College of Art and Design, where she studies under the abstract expressionist painter, Elaine de Kooning. She gets introduced to iconography, which I did, and actually goes to a monastery to study icons. And the book ends up having a mystery to it where she and Elaine de Kooning and a nun at the monastery have a connection that you don't learn about till the end of the book. So, but because that book took six or more years, another reason it took so long was I had a New York literary agent I was working with, and I did not like what she wanted me to do with the book. So after over a year of working with editors that she wanted me to change the book to make it more hardcore commercial fiction, and I wanted it to keep this Southern literary and spiritual element to it, I left her. So instead of getting a book deal with a big publishing company and maybe more quotation marks success, I was published by a small press out of Mississippi. And the editor had integrity, and the book is the book I wanted it to be, Cherry Bomb. But while I was waiting for the different stages of publishing to happen with that book in 2017, I sort of have ADD, and I have to be doing more than one thing at a time.
That resonates for me. For me too.
Yeah. So I published 2 other books. That one came out in August. I published books in January and May of that year while Cherry Bomb was going to be coming out. And this is with 3 different publishers. And had any of them known about the other, it probably wouldn't have happened because from their point of view, that's a marketing nightmare.
Yeah, absolutely.
But from my point of view, it's not. And here's why. The books had completely different audiences. The first one, Tangles and Plaques, A Mother and Daughter Face Alzheimer's, is a memoir about my mother's journey with Alzheimer's and our relationship. And I took 60 blog posts that I had written over the last 8 years of her life and put them together into a book. So it was so much already written that all I did was organize it, find a publisher, and publish it in January. Then while I was waiting on, the various stages of it to happen and the various stages of Cherry Bomb to happen, I was having a conversation with an elderly neighbor who is sort of a mentor of mine. She was a writer who got her PhD in aging when she was 65. She's in her 80s now. And we were talking about women at various stages of our lives and what second chances look like and second opportunities. And I said, I think I'm going to publish an anthology, and it's going to be Second Bloomings, Becoming the Women We're Meant to Be. And I got 24 women to contribute essays to it. I got a forward by Anne Lamott, and Mercer University Press published that in May of that year. So that was a banner year. These 3 books from 3 different publishers and 3 different genres came out that year. And editing the anthology was so much fun because one of my favorite things to do is to pull together people with talent and direct things. Like my dream job would be to direct a movie or to direct a news broadcast, like that movie. What was the movie where I forgot the favorite
Network?
Yes.
Or broadcast news? Yeah.
Broadcast, one of those.
Yeah.
I would have loved to direct things.
Yeah.
So when you do an anthology, you invite the people you want to write the essays based on your theme. And then you edit their work and then you organize it. And it's so much fun. So I decided to do it again. So in 2018, I published my second anthology, Southern Writers on Writing. And this had 13 men and 13 women writing essays all about writing, all contemporary, of course. University Press of Mississippi jumped on that. They and I both could not believe it had already been done. So that one came out in May, I think, of 2018. And then my publisher for Cherry Bomb, my novel, lives in a small town in Mississippi. He wanted me to go on a little book tour to libraries in the small towns to talk about Cherry Bomb. And I did, even though I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. I lived in Oxford when I went to Ole Miss, but I had never visited all these little towns like Eupora and West Point and Aberdeen and Pontotoc. And so I researched each one before I drove down there. And I was fascinated by the history, some of the famous people there, some of the famous buildings and museums and all of that. So I learned a lot about my own home state.
Yeah.
And as I got back from each of these visits where I would speak to the Friends of the Library groups in each library, and by the way, there were 50 people at one of those meetings.
Yeah.
usually a dozen to 20, which is a lot in a small town.
Yeah.
Of course, they don't have as much else to do. But when I came home, my inclination would have been to write a blog post about my trip to Eupora and speaking to the Friends of the Library. And as I started to write the blog post, something interesting happened. I asked myself, what if? What if I write a short story instead? And I make up a fictional author and I name her Adele Covington. And I have her going on this book tour and meeting these really diverse people who all have a lot of heavy personal issues, sexual abuse, cancer, Alzheimer's, adoption. There were like 10 different issues because there were 10 stories. So I had Adele, somebody said it was kind of like Touched by an Angel in Mississippi.
Oh, nice.
She helps the people. And I published that short story collection and called it Friends of the Library. And that came out in 2019. And just when I was doing that, I'm part of a large international book club organization called the Pulpwood Queens. And its founder, Kathy L. Murphy, started it 21 years ago now. And every January, they have a big convention. And they'll have like 20-something authors and several hundred book club members. There are like 800 of these book clubs all over the world.
I've never heard of it. It's interesting.
So if your book is chosen as the book of the month for April, then, all these book clubs are going to be reading your book that month. Yeah. And then everybody whose books were chosen for that year is invited to Jefferson, Texas, to the Girlfriend Weekend to speak on panels, which I've done 4 or 5 different years over the years. So Kathy was aware that I had edited several anthologies, and she said, I want an anniversary anthology for our 2020 meeting, January 2020, and I'd like you to edit it. And I'd like essays by as many authors as will submit them and by a lot of the book club members. When she said, will you do this? And I said, sure, fun, right up my alley. So I published my 3rd anthology, The Pulpwood Queens, to celebrate 20 years in December of 2019. Yeah. And it had 67 essays in it.
Wow.
So it was a lot of work. But again, it doesn't feel like work to me. It was just a lot of fun. So, and some of the people who read those short stories loved one of the 10 short stories because it was about a Black boy from Memphis and a white girl from Jackson, Mississippi, who fall in love on the Ole Miss campus in the 1960s. And that was John and Mary Margaret. So several of my readers said, we want more of their story. Why don't you turn it into a novel? I'm not sure I would have ever thought to do that if I hadn't been encouraged to. And so my 7th book and 2nd novel, John and Mary Margaret, just came out in June.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the journey through all those books. And I've already got another anthology in the works.
I'll bet you do.
They're being turned into me right now. And I've just started another novel. So I should have said this earlier. I just turned 70 in March. And I'm living my best life. I'm having the best time. I'm doing what I've always wanted to do. So I just want to encourage people that it's never too late to do what you always wanted to do, And
that's awesome, Susan. That's great. Time. So John and Mary Margaret, it's available now. It came out in June. Where can people find it? Anywhere
books are sold. If you've got an independent bookseller in your town, ask them to order it. Because it's going to be carried in bookstores in the South, of course, primarily. Yep. But, in Minnesota or wherever else, just call your bookstore and say, please order me a copy of John and Mary Margaret by Susan Cushman. Or, of course, you can get it online at Amazon. Yep. And Barnes & Noble has it, other places like that.
Is it available on audio as well?
No, it wasn't done in audio. It is on Kindle.
It is on Kindle, okay.
It's hardcover, softcover, and Kindle.
Gotcha.
All 3 of them. And it's really short. It's a quick read. I've had some people say they read it in one day.
Oh, wow. That's,
So thankfully it's because they couldn't put it down, they said.
That's great. Well, congratulations, Susan, on all of those, especially John and Mary Margaret. I will put in the show notes a link to the book as well. So if people are thinking, hey, I like this. What's the name of the book? Again, John and Mary Margaret. And I'm actually looking here because we're recording this and Susan and I are looking at each other. I like the cover of it. I'm assuming the cover that must be Ole Miss. One of the buildings at Ole Miss.
That's the Lyceum building right there on the bottom.
Gotcha.
And of course, the people holding hands are John and Mary Margaret.
John and Mary Margaret. Yeah.
And Koehler Books, Koehler, published it. And they do a terrific job with book covers.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful cover.
Yeah.
Very striking.
I think they do a good job. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool.
Thanks.
All right, Susan. So I've been asking you a lot of questions. So this is your opportunity to ask me something. And since we don't know each other, we've known each other for 34 minutes now. What would you like to ask me that I can answer for you and for everyone else?
Okay. Well, sort of, I'm going to throw a couple of things and you can either mix them together or take your choice. I'm wanting to know why you started the podcast. Like, what is your mission? That's one question. And then another question is, what do you think makes somebody a cool person?
Yeah.
Since you say you're talking to cool people.
Perfect. Yes, I will definitely combine these.
Okay.
I'll start with the cool person thing. And I've shared this a couple times on the show. I'll share it again, how the name of this podcast came out, because people ask me about it all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was November of 2019. And I had said, hey, I'm going to launch this in January of 2020, which means I need to record some episodes before I launch it, because you need to have some stuff to put out there.
Right.
And one of my guests, Krista Rizzo, she was a guest, she was probably my fourth or fifth interview. And I remember, and she's a friend of mine, and we got done and I said, she's like, that was really fun. I'm like, well, I'm really struggling with the name. Like, I'm not very good like naming things. And, and I was like, what do you think of this? And I had this name from somebody else, and it was kind of a little too businessy for my taste. It was kind of like it was a little dry. And she goes, oh, it's really easy. Just call it Talking to Cool People. And I'm like, yep, that's it. I was like, okay. So Susan, I didn't have any artwork. I didn't have a title. I didn't, like when you publish a podcast out there, it's just like a book. You have to have a title and artwork and all these things. So I created the title of the show and all the artwork for it after I had recorded some episodes. And I'm so glad that Krista did that, because I don't think that would have been, I never would have come up with that. So for me, a cool person is anybody with an interesting story to tell. So I'm sure as an author, you probably identify with that.
That's great.
If you look at my list of guests, this will be episode, I believe, 89. And if you could get a wider range of people to talk to, I've talked to college students, I've talked to quasi-famous people, I've talked to authors, I've talked to retired Navy SEALs, therapists. And to me, what makes somebody cool is that they've got an interesting story to tell and that they're curious. Yeah. For me, the main thing I look for in my guests are, and the story itself might not be the most interesting part. It's the curiosity that comes with it. And also just like, I'm curious about people generally. Like I'm kind of a student of humanity. So I think that Susan's journey to become an author is interesting. I think that for a guest who's like a musician, like I think that's interesting. I think almost everybody's story is interesting, which therefore makes them cool to me. So that's for the audience listening. My level of cool is not about like cool, like this person is a cool person. It's more like, are they interesting and are they curious? So that's how I started the podcast. Yes. Which also much broadens my ability to talk to a lot of people, which is helpful. I'm also somebody, I just really like most people, like there's certain people that like, don't like most people. I really like most people. So I will admit my bar for cool is probably a lot like, the bar to get over my cool meter is probably much lower than other people, but I like it that way. So how the podcast came about comes from what I wanted to do when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I wanted to be Johnny Carson and then Jay Leno, because I think that switch happened when I want to say 12. It's like 1989, 1990 when Johnny retired and Jay Leno took over. And I said, man, I couldn't think of a better job than to sit in a comfortable chair and talk to people. And I didn't realize as a kid that like those interviews are kind of, here's Johnny, here's what you're going to ask Susan about. Like, here's the things we want you to ask her about. She's got a new book coming out. Some of it's a little scripted. And so this podcast is kind of my small scale version of getting to just talk to people about what they're up to in their life, which is really fun.
Are you having fun? Yeah.
I'm a blast. It's my favorite thing. If I could just do this all day, I would do it. Like I said, this will be, I think we're going to release your episode very shortly. I think you'll be episode 89. So I've been consistent. I've been releasing keep it going. I have an endless list of guests that I want to have on or that want to be on. So yeah, I'll keep it going. I love doing this.
That's great.
If I could do this, if I could just do this, if I could only do this, I would probably just do this. But
that's great.
Yeah. So thanks for the questions. That's yeah.
Sure.
So Susan, I got a few more questions for you if you've got a little more time for me.
Of course.
All right. So what are you passionate about?
I'm passionate about just about everything that I engage with and care about because I'm a passionate person. But
I can tell.
I think two or three on the top are obviously about racial equality,
Mm-hmm.
and also about my faith, about Orthodox spirituality, and also about adoption. Yeah, I'm passionate about a cure for Alzheimer's. So I have a lot of causes because of my own life situations.
Yeah. Do you you write about these things, obviously.
Right.
Do you get involved in other ways with the things you're passionate about?
Yeah, sure. Well, with the Alzheimer's, I have been a speaker at some conventions and conferences. I volunteered. There's a group called Alz Authors, alzauthors.org. And anyone who is caregiving for someone with Alzheimer's should Google them because there are over 300 authors, I'm one of them, who have written books about caregiving for someone with Alzheimer's. And you can go through and find person caring for a spouse, person caring for a mother. You can find based on the themes and get books that will relate to your own situation. So I have volunteered with them. I've done some editing and some work with them. And like I said, I've spoken. And then I was a volunteer. I led a creative writing class at a senior living facility here in Memphis for 9 months. We had to quit because of COVID.
Yeah.
We tried going Zoom, but most of the people were in their 70s, 80s, 90s and didn't really like Zooming.
I see that.
But because my mom spent the last 8 years of her life in a nursing home and 3 years before that in assisted living, I feel like I will always want to find a way to give back to the people who took care of her, because she really got good care. And so that's another way that I've done that. I'm trying to think. And then with church, I've done a lot there, everything from teaching Sunday school to being a church secretary to being in charge of committees. So I'm involved always in the things I'm passionate about one way or another.
Yeah. Did you see the movie The Father last year with Anthony Hopkins?
No.
It was I believe it was a play and they turned it into a movie. I don't remember if he has Alzheimer's or dementia, but highly recommend it.
I'm writing it down. How did I miss that?
He won Best Picture. He won Best Actor last year.
Oh, wow.
So he played. So it's about Anthony Hopkins is a scene. He's the dad, the father, and it's about. I won't spoil how the movie's done, but it's brilliant. It's really about his experience with like dementia or Alzheimer's. I forget which one, but also his children's experience working with him.
I don't know how I missed it. Of course, if it's in the theaters, we didn't go until we got our vaccines.
Yep.
Do you know if it's streaming somewhere right now?
It is definitely streaming. You can buy it on like Amazon. It should be like Amazon Prime. Yeah, it's called The Father. Is tremendous. It was up for Best Picture. He won Best Actor.
Thank you. I can't wait.
There it is. That. So hopefully that's useful for everybody.
Yeah.
Awesome. My grandmother on my mom's side had Alzheimer's, and then she had a stroke. So I'll never forget when she passed away. I remember the pastor who was leading the service said, this is a disease that can be quite nice for the person experiencing it. It's actually kind of and very hard for the family. So that was kind of our experience too, is that she woke up every day and every day was kind of a new experience for her. And especially for my mother, it was very close to her as a vet. It's a very challenging disease. I saw that in my family as well.
Well, my mother's mother had it first and then my mother. So obviously I think I'm third generation. I'm 70 and I'm remembering at what ages my mother and my grandmother started having issues and at what ages they had to go into a nursing home. And I've already talked with our kids about my wishes. And I have long-term care insurance and I don't want them to try to take care of me at home.
Yeah.
Because I want them to have their own lives. Yeah. And they were a little resistant at that at first. And I'm like, the money will be here for it if it happens. And again, watching the fact that my mother and my grandmother both had good care in the same nursing home in Jackson, Mississippi, but 20 years apart.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah.
But correct me if I'm wrong, you would know more about this than I would, but I think a lot of the new science is really the best way is to stay really active with your mind, like writing books, active in the community, the things that you're doing are some of the best ways to stave off, to keep yourself active. Yeah. I mean,
I'm sure it helps to a degree, but I think, at some point, hopefully the research will come up with some medicine that will help too.
Let's hope so. Yeah, absolutely. Well, the next question I have for you is about the thing that you're most proud of. So what is it that you're most proud of?
Part of me wants to immediately say my late life writing career, but I'm going to say that's the thing I'm second most proud of. And I'm going to say my family and especially my marriage of 51 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I was 19. My husband was 21 when we got married in 1970. And we literally grew up together.
Yeah.
We learned to love each other unconditionally and forgive a myriad of sins, over all those years. And I'm remembering the bumpy times we went through and how glad I am that we stayed together, because we're having the best time now,
Yeah.
And it's great. We adopted these 3 amazing kids that I told you about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have the 4 mixed race granddaughters, and our oldest son is getting married in November. And he and his fiance live in New Orleans, and sadly, they
without power.
They evacuated. They won't have any power for over a month.
Oh my God! Is that they've gotten the news now?
Yeah, they're staying with friends in another city, and it's going to be awful. But anyway, so I think I'm most proud of my family, and then secondly of this late life career and the writing, because it is really the 2 things I always wanted to do, 3 things: be married, have children, and write books.
And here we are. It's perfect.
And here we are.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
So Susan, what's something you're afraid that might actually be true about you?
Well, this might sound a little bit weird, but I might be a racist, or I might be a narcissist. These are both issues I'm really well acquainted with in others, including some people I'm very close to. But I'm thinking, like the Bible says, let him who is without sin throw the first stone. So I'm very slow to judge others, because I don't think and I can't speak for anyone else, am pure of heart and are without sin in these areas. Sure, I have a Black son-in-law. I have these mixed race granddaughters. I wrote this book about race, but that doesn't mean that growing up as a white person in Mississippi that there wasn't something ingrained in me that I believe gets ingrained in our culture, that I believe we all have to deal with. And the place to start with that is by being honest about how we look at things, how we feel about things.
Yeah, I was sharing with you before we got on. I'm originally from Minnesota, and I was actually back there this weekend, and I visited George Floyd Square with my parents.
Wow!
And when that happened, just to share this with you, when that happened, I came to find out that Officer Chauvin went to my high school.
Oh my goodness!
So, and my parents live my parents live about 3 miles from Cup Foods where that happened. It's like down in South Minneapolis, and Minnesota's been a little bit of a hotbed for this. Like there's another African-American guy killed. I think it was earlier this year. We had Philander O'Castle a few years ago. And I've had to look at my biases as well. So like in coaching, we call them like your undistinguished biases. Sometimes you have distinguished biases. You're like, yes, I know this about me. And a lot of times you have undistinguished biases.
Okay.
And, anybody who's listening who says like, we all got them. Because we're all raised, we learn as children, we build those patterns,
right?
Our neural patterns. And then I think what you said is so important is like first of all, to get curious about it and be like, hey, like, what are my distinguished or undistinguished biases? And then when you can own them, then you can, if you want to, you can do something about them.
Right.
Or just, it's the white fragility thing of just like, hey, like, I'm white and I don't know what to do here. And I'm scared and I'm probably going to get this really wrong. And I'm still willing to do it because I am committed to being better. And that's the thing. Yeah.
And see, and I was afraid of getting it wrong in writing the book, John and Mary Margaret. And so what I did was, I have 2 author friends who are Black men, and I have a Black male protagonist in the book. And they both agreed to be early readers and read early drafts of the book. And that's also known as a sensitivity reader. That's getting someone of a different race or gender or culture from the author to give you good feedback on the history, the language you're using, and all of that. And they were both fabulous. One is Jeffrey Blunt, and he was the first Black director at NBC News.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah. And he wrote a wonderful novel called The Emancipation of Evan Walls. And he wrote a fabulous blurb for me. And the other guy, Ralph Eubanks, was at Ole Miss during part of the time in which my book is set. And he's from Marks, Mississippi, and he now lives in Washington, D.C., and he's a visiting professor at Ole Miss. And he was also, he and his books, A Place Like Mississippi is his new book that just came out. And they were both so helpful because to do that by myself, I really could have messed up. I mean, it's amazing how many just phrases and words and cliches and things that you just don't want to do that would be offensive.
Absolutely.
And yet I think the fear of doing that keeps a lot of people from doing it.
Yep.
And in January, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal by James Campbell, who wrote about James Baldwin. And he is writing about cultural appropriation. There was also Toni Morrison is also in this article. And here's a little thing that he said about it that I thought was excellent from the Wall Street Journal. Writers on each side of the color line have more than just the right to cross the divide and report back. It is their duty. Imaginative life depends on cultural exchange. Literature depends on the imagination. To put it another way, culture is cultural appropriation. Any artist worth the name should be willing to take a punch for it.
Yeah.
So that's what I felt like I was doing, was being willing to take a punch for it in writing this. And I've been really surprised not to have gotten a whole lot of pushback from it. I've been shocked. I've been expecting it. You know, I've spoken, I went on a book tour for 2 weeks in June, all through the South. 2,300 miles I drove, and I had 9 events and in-person events, and nobody asking me about, well, how do you feel about you being a white woman writing this? Nobody even brought it up, which it just greatly surprised me. There may be people thinking it who aren't going to contact me and say that.
Yeah.
You know, I will say one of the most heartening experiences I had was meeting with my first ever men's book club here in Memphis, and they're all Black. And the leader of the book club is a librarian at a branch library that was a Negro branch back in the day. And so I'm having this book club talk with them by Zoom a few weeks ago. And one guy keeps asking me some pretty critical questions, and I'm a little bit nervous because he's right, and I want to be humble and I want to be appreciative. But then at the end of the time, he said, well, Miss Susan, I just have to tell you that you nailed it. And I just took a big sigh of relief because that's the audience I want to please.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I want to reach a white audience with the message, but I want to please my Black readers and not offend them.
Yeah.
You know, so that was a great
Beautiful,
experience.
Susan. That's really cool.
Thankful for that experience. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Susan.
Sure.
All right. We're going to wrap it up here. And I just have a couple other questions for you. So this is my I call this my grand philosophy question. How do you see the world?
Right now, or just in general?
However you'd like to answer it is A-okay with me.
Well, as an Orthodox Christian, I see the world as a temporary home, and the kingdom of God is my permanent home. If I didn't have this faith and this vision, I might be overwhelmed with despair over the state affairs of the world at present. It's seemingly unending racism, poverty, violence everywhere. And of course, Christ said, my kingdom is not of this world. And yet my faith does not prevent me from caring about what's happening in the world or doing my part to help. It's just like I keep small bills in my car and give them out to people on the street corners all the time. I introduce myself and ask their name, and ask them to pray for me. And I see myself in them. There I go. Had I had some bad knocks, here I am having had a lot of blessings and opportunities that they might not have had,
Yeah.
So I think the most important thing that I've done to help, though, is writing. And especially is writing this book, John and Mary Margaret, and also my book about Alzheimer's, Tangles and Plaques. I've gotten a lot of people said it really helped them in their journey with their loved one who has Alzheimer's. So I see the world as a place that is suffering, that is in a lot of pain. It's not my final resting place, but while I'm here, I want to do everything I can.
Yeah. Susan, we've talked about the latest book, and all the books are available on Amazon. Bookstores can order them, hard copy, paperback. What about, you'd mentioned your blog a few times. Is your blog still available for people to check out? Is that something that's still out there?
Yeah, it's on my website, www.susancushman.com.
Great.
Within the website, there's the blog.
Great. And so you proactively mentioned it. You've got the website, because we're just talking about how are the different ways people can connect with you. The last way that I always ask authors about is, can people follow you on Goodreads? I'm a Goodreads user.
Yeah, absolutely. Goodreads, Instagram, Twitter, all of those.
Cool.
I'm pretty active I love social media.
Yeah, it's great.
I'm on there a lot. Yeah.
That's fun. I will put all of your links in the show notes so people can connect with you on Twitter, and on Instagram. Connect with Susan on Goodreads. Go out, grab the book, John and Mary Margaret. Sounds amazing. I can't wait to check it out. My parents are gonna like this book too. My parents are very active in racial justice issues as well. Good, I think my parents are similar. They're a couple years younger than you, also married very young. They're from Kansas, so not the deep South, but definitely, like kind of in the middle there.
Midwest, yeah.
Midwest, but there's some racial stuff that happened in my family as well. Sure. Like there's definitely some biases on one side of my family. So I just want to congratulate you on the latest book. Thank you so much for being on with us today.
Thank you.
As I have all my guests do, I'd love if you would leave us with words of wisdom. And these should be some short and sweet words of wisdom. What would you like to leave us with, Susan?
That can fit on a Post-it note.
That can fit on a Post-it note. What writer doesn't have Post-it notes? Very of course. Yeah. What do you got for us, Susan?
Well, you asked me about this ahead of time, so I had some time to think about it. I wrote something on several Post-it notes, and like a typical author, I crumbled them up and threw them away, and decided, and instead of my own words, I'm going to share the words of one of my favorite writers from Mississippi, Eudora Welty. And Eudora Welty makes 2 cameo appearances in my book, John and Mary Margaret, because Mary Margaret becomes friends with her when she's 14 and 18 years old, and they live in the same neighborhood, because I lived in that neighborhood near Eudora Welty's house in the early 70s. But I never got to meet her. So I feel like I got to know her through my character, Mary Margaret. And so here's what Eudora Welty, I think, would say about my book, John and Mary Margaret, and other books that people write that they feel like are important. Great fiction shows us not how to conduct our behavior, but how to feel. Eventually, it may show us how to face our feelings and face our actions, and to have new inklings about what they mean. A good novel of any year can initiate us into our own new experience.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you, Jason.
Pleasure to be on. Thank you so much.
Enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Talking to Cool People with Jason Frizzell. If you enjoyed today's episode, please tell your friends. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and give us a shout out, or take a moment to leave a review on iTunes. If something from today's episode piqued your interest and you'd like to connect, email us at podcast@jasonfrizzell.com. We love hearing from our listeners because you're cool people too.